name is Leah. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator here at Women's Shelters Canada. And I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. I'm really excited. I think this is a super important conversation. It's going to be a great discussion with our three panelists who I'll introduce in a second. And I'm really looking forward to it. Before we get into it, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And, I think particularly right now, the past week, we've had the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. October 4th, as I'm sure many of you on the webinar know, is a day to honor, remember, take action related to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And so those were some really important opportunities for reflection. And I think for those of us like myself who are settlers here, it's important to carry that forward beyond those days where it's right in front of us to think about how that applies to every conversation that we have and all of the work we do. So I know there are people joining us from across Turtle Island. That's the joy of the virtual setting. So I would encourage you to say hi. You can put your name, say hello in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. And if you don't know the territory you're on, this is a great friendly prompt to look that up and find out a little more. So I have mentioned the interpretation, and the instructions for that are in the chat. You can use the interpretation button at the bottom. Same with the captioning. It's the CC button at the bottom right beside interpretation. The captioning, unfortunately, is only available in English at the moment. That is a limitation of the platform, and I do apologize for that. Yeah, we are working on it. But for now, we have that available for those of you listening in English. So as well, you have probably noticed your video is off, you are muted. To make sure we have the best audio quality today, because we have such a large group already, we have about 120 of you, which is amazing. But to keep things sort of manageable, good quality audio quality, only our panelists will have their video and audio on. That doesn't mean we don't want your participation. We absolutely want your participation. And there are two fantastic ways you can do that. You can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to say hello, to comment. If you're having any tech issues, please let me know in the chat. If you have a question for our presenters, you can put your question in the Q&A box. And I really encourage you to put questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. It makes it way easier for me to keep track of all of those, and we can get to as many of those as possible at the end of our presentations here. And of course, we ask that everyone sort of respect the learning space that we're in and engage in a really, respectful, non-discriminatory or hateful manner for today's conversation. And last note, and then I'm almost done talking, but we are recording today's session, and so this will be available afterwards for anyone who has to leave partway through or couldn't attend, or if you have colleagues who wanted to attend and couldn't. And yeah, so those are all of our housekeeping reminders. And I'll get started with our actual discussion here, which is going to be about trans inclusion and gender diversity in domestic violence shelters, as you all know. And as I've said, it is a really important conversation. We've gotten a lot of questions, a lot of requests for resources on this from some of the shelters we work with. And so hopefully this can be a really helpful conversation today. We're going to hear from three speakers. So we're going to start with Wendy D'Souza from Medtrack, who's going to share some of the findings from the Transformed Project, which is a community-based research and action initiative focused on two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people's experiences with intimate partner violence and accessing service and support. So she'll speak to that. And then we'll hear from Veronica Merryfield, who is a board member at Willow House in Cape Breton. And she's going to speak to some of her own experiences, as well as her work on staff training, policy changes, and all the other things they've been working on there. And we'll round it out with Carly Cole from the Wheatland Crisis Society, who is going to talk about how their shelter came to deliver services to all people, not just cis women, and how that model allows them to support a diverse range of families. So it's going to be a great conversation. And after the three presentations, we will have quite a bit of time for questions. And so once again, I really encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, and we'll go through them at the end. So one last thing before we get started, we want to know a little bit more about all of you who are listening in today. So I'm going to put a poll up on the screen. It should be popping up for you now. And we're just asking a couple of questions here. You can go through and submit your answers. It's totally anonymous. We're asking about, your role in the shelter. Are you frontline, manager, executive director, a board member, something else? If you scroll down a bit, you'll see, where's your organization at in terms of becoming more inclusive? We know this is a journey and this is a learning space. So, no shame wherever you are in these answers, it's totally fine. And we're happy to have you here. We're just interested in getting a sense of where folks are at. And the last question is, if you've gotten started with this work, have you made changes to policy and procedure as part of it? So take a couple seconds, put your answers in, hit submit, and we'll take a look together. And quite a few of you have participated. I'm going to give it another 10 seconds or so to let everyone get through the questions. Awesome. So I'm going to end the poll and share results here. So hopefully you can all see that, but just in case, it looks like most of you, about 55%, are frontline, which is great. We also have quite a few managers, some executive directors, some other, so you can feel free to let us know more in the chat if you want. We also have quite a few people who've chosen sort of 70% in that, we've done some work in this area, some where it's very new, some who've done a little bit more work. And so I think that's great. I mean, it's a really good place to start today's conversation with folks having done a bit of work. They're really thinking about this, actively engaged, and hopefully that means there's lots that can come out of today's conversation. And that last question there, a lot of you have said you have made changes, pretty much an equal amount. Those changes are in progress, which makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to close that poll. And thank you so much for participating. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, Wendy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Leah and Women's Shelter Canada, the amazing panelists who are here today. Thank you so much. I'm going to just share my screen. So bear with me here. And thank you all so much for coming, right? And taking the time to be a part of this important conversation. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wendy Gisouza, Wendy D. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the REACT Youth Program Coordinator at Medtrack, Action on Violence. I'm stepping in today to present on behalf of Laura Hartley, our amazing program director. And I'm very honored to be a part of this discussion today and be sharing research findings and important implications for service providers arising from the Transform Project. A little bit about the Transform Project. It's a bilingual, community-based research project led by Medtrack Action on Violence in partnership with Centre de Francophone. Over 3 years, the Transform Project has engaged in community-based participatory research and education with the goal of addressing barriers and increasing access to health and social supports for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people affected by intimate partner violence. Now, Medtrack Action on Violence is a nonprofit organization based in Toronto that is committed to partnering with individuals, communities, and institutions to change ideas, actions, and policies with the goal of ending gender-based violence. While Medtrack has historically devoted to advancing safety, justice, and equity for women and youth, with the creation of the Transform Project, Medtrack has expanded its inclusivity efforts by working collaboratively with community members and multi-sector service providers to research and understand the experiences of intimate partner violence within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. The Transform project has been generously funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and the City of Toronto. Now, I'll begin today by talking a bit more about the Transform project's methodology, which was quite unique in its approach. It was a participatory research project grounded in really centering the unique experiences and expertise of two-spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals with experiences of intimate partner violence. Now, in order to achieve this, the project established a peer leadership group that has been guiding the project since its inception. The peer leadership group began with about 10 members in total and now currently consists of about 6 community members who are a diverse group of two-spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals holding many intersecting identities and bringing diverse life experiences. We also found it integral to work collaboratively with cross-sectoral service providers from over 20 organizations who work in various capacities with two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks. Now, these individuals make up our advisory committee, and they have also offered the service provider perspective while also sharing insights their organizations have gained from working directly with clients from two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. Both the advisory committee and the peer leadership group have been foundational throughout the life of the project, from the research phase to the development of our resources and launch of our own knowledge symposium. Now, to share a bit more about the Transform's research process, it began with a thorough environmental scan and literature review. We then conducted our own research through online surveys, focus groups, and individual key informant interviews. The PLG members provided their expertise and insight to help design the actual research survey and focus group questions. They were also trained in trauma-informed interviewing techniques and supported in leading the focus groups and key informant interviews. So both the PLG and the AC supported with outreach on the research to over 125 organizations. Promotional materials were sent in 3 different formats for increased accessibility. Over 3,000 people were reached through organic social media engagement and sponsored advertisement. And in the end, we received 136 survey responses. We were able to hold 4 focus groups with 14 people, many identifying as trans femmes, women of color, trans and non-binary groups, newcomers, those identifying as Francophone or Arabic, and two-spirit. And there were 4 individual interviews with community members and 7 key informant interviews with service providers working in the gender-based violence sector. So we would like to also acknowledge Eileen Hyman, who was the lead researcher for the online survey. All research activities were informed by an intersectional and trauma-informed approach that prioritized safety and considered the unique needs of gender minority community members, as well as social and economic identities people hold that may expose them to intersecting systems of oppression. Now, after completing these surveys, interviews, and focus groups, the PLG members were trained and then were able to support in the coding and analysis of the research findings as well. Okay. I'd like to now share some of our key findings that arose out of that research. 4 out of 5 two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people have experienced abuse in their lifetime. Over 80% of participants have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime, while 44% of participants have experienced intimate partner violence in the past 2 years. 40% of people 40% of people believed the violence they experienced was because of their gender identity or expression. 40% experienced transphobia on a regular basis and 36% experience multiple forms of discrimination. Now, these research findings are significant in demonstrating the high levels of violence being experienced by folks within the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community, demonstrating the need for responsive and affirming supports and services to address the impacts of that violence. Now, let's talk a bit about some of those impacts. In the shelter sector, we know that experiencing relationship violence can have serious and wide-ranging impacts on all aspects of an individual, including physically, emotionally, cognitively, even financially, sexually, and spiritually. So the Transforms Project's research demonstrates the wide-ranging impacts of violence on all aspects of a person's life, and it also shows us the specific impacts intimate partner violence has on individuals within the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. On this slide, you can see the 6 most common impacts people identified experiencing as a result of intimate partner violence. It's important and significant to highlight that 89% of respondents identified experiencing mental health problems or psychological distress as a result of intimate partner violence. And we can see here that 41.7%, right, describes substance abuse, 41.7% housing issues, 45.3% financial problems, 38.1% physical health. And other notable impacts that were identified by respondents include spiritual or cultural problems, about 28%, 33% identified work problems, 10% identified child welfare involvement, and 10% identified legal issues. Some of the impacts not listed includes suicide, delayed transition, and isolation with about 10%. Now, as we previously mentioned, a key aspect of the research was identifying the barriers that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people experience when attempting to access health and social supports for their experiences of violence. The research demonstrates that there are significant barriers that make accessing supports difficult for the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community. And one of the main barriers being that 75% of respondents are facing mental health challenges and many different forms of disability that create barriers to accessing those services and supports. This is really important piece to highlight, given that so many of the survey respondents indicated that they are having mental health issues, and those issues are actually making accessing services and support more difficult. Also, it was significant that 33% of respondents in the study mentioned that resources were not responsive to their specific needs as a two-spirit, non-binary, and/or trans person, and 21% did not know of any resources or supports that they could go to for help. Fear and trust were also identified as major issues in terms of seeking services and supports, with 32% said that they did not trust services would meet and would be able to meet their specific needs, and 31% of participants shared that they had negative experiences using resources and supports in the past. Given the research findings, it is clear that there are significant implications for the provision support services for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals, and the shelter sector is a significant provider of services that could be hugely beneficial to this community. Through the research process, two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community members, as well as advisory committee members, shared their suggestions on what changes need to be made to address barriers so that support services can provide much more inclusive, affirming, and responsive supports. Today, I will highlight a few of the main areas that arose, and that's creating gender inclusive policies and practices, using inclusive language, the need for a commitment to ongoing capacity building and learning opportunities, and integrating peer-led approaches. As we saw, many individuals felt that services were not responsive to their needs, and many have had negative experiences with services in the past. In terms of gender inclusive policies, that's a larger undertaking for any organization. And here are some key suggestions that arose out of the project. Creating gender inclusive rather than gender segregated programs, options for self-identification on intake forms, protocols on client-staff interactions relating to disclosures of gender identity, protocols on addressing transphobic, homophobic, and oppressive behaviors, engaging in specific outreach to two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, and visibly printed resources for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks. Participants want to see themselves reflected in intimate partner violence resources and services, which can affirm and validate that particular relationship dynamics that they experience.
Wendy, sorry, I'm just going to jump in here. If you wouldn't mind slowing down a tiny bit just to help out the interpreters there.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that reminder. And thank you to our amazing interpreters. So a second way that organizations can work to create more responsive and affirming services is by familiarizing themselves with the language and the terminology used within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, and ensuring that all service providers respect individuals' names and pronouns. It is also important for service providers to not assume someone's gender identity or pronouns based on their appearance or their voice. These are important steps in building rapport and trust with the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans service users. As a result of this important feedback, we've created a transformed glossary with support and guidance from the PLG. This is an excellent tool for service providers to use to enhance their understanding of terminology and language that is used within the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities to describe their identities, relationships, and experiences. Okay. Now, challenging conscious and unconscious bias and discrimination within organizations through ongoing education and training is essential in order to address the attitudinal barriers that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people are facing when seeking support. Not only do service providers need more education to uncover and challenge their own internal biases, the research also demonstrated that many two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people are not only survivors of violence, but their experiences of violence are particular due to their gender and other overlapping identities that they hold. For many participants, having to choose which aspect of one's identity to lead with. So do I lead with my gender identity, my race, my disability in order to access supports was a very complex venture that oftentimes left them with little to no meaningful resources. Therefore, service providers need to have both a broad understanding of how forms of systemic oppression impact individuals' experiences of violence, while also gaining a specific understanding of the particular forms of violence that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities experience and the impacts of that violence. Now, this nuanced understanding of community members' experiences is so necessary in order to provide appropriate and responsive services. And finally, peer-led programming was frequently raised as a suggestion on the types of services that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals would like to see more of. There are many different models for peer-led programming and many important considerations for service providers when seeking to integrate a peer-led program in their work. For more information on peer-led programs, you can check out one of our webinars that focuses on key considerations for service providers when seeking to integrate peer-led programming. And I'll definitely share some of these resources in the chat once I've completed here. And here we want to introduce some of the resources. So the second exciting phase of the project after completing the research was working together with the PLG and advisory committee to translate the research findings into a variety of resources and tools to both support Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans community members and service providers. We were able to create and launch 5 new resources that you can download for free from Medtrack's website, including the transformed glossary of terms, a comprehensive glossary of terminology commonly used to describe identities, relationships, and experiences within the Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. It also has a beautiful index of different pride flags representing gender and sexually diverse communities. We also have Preventing IPV in Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, which is designed for service providers to support in understanding types of relationships that folks are engaged in, types of relationship violence folks are experiencing, impacts of violence, barriers to seeking support, and what red flags and green flags are, particularly within the Two-Spirit, non-binary, trans relationships that would be helpful for service providers in engaging in discussion about healthy and unhealthy relationships with a Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans client. And also healthy and unhealthy relationships in Two-Spirit, non-binary, trans communities, which is a resource designed for Two-Spirit, non-binary, trans community members, which goes over types of relationship violence, how to seek support, and green and red flags in a relationship. Making Gender and Name Changes on Legal Documents, a legal resource for Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals, and some published research findings. We have also created and recorded 2 webinars. The first one is focused on supporting service providers in providing affirming and supportive services. And the second webinar is focused on implementing peer-led approaches to programming. And finally, we also have recordings and notes from all 3 days of our Knowledge Exchange Symposium, which we held last November. It included PLG members and advisory committee members presenting and speaking on panels addressing a variety of issues and topics relating to the project. While this was just a brief presentation on our research findings and implications of the research for service providers, I hope that you will take this time to access our important health promotion tools and resources, webinars, and symposium recordings. These resources will support your organization in integrating the vital changes needed to address barriers and increase access to affirming supportive services as recommended by Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans individuals themselves. We invite you to please visit our project website by visiting Medtrack's website, medtrack.org/transformed, which I'll be sharing in the chat. And there you will find more information about the project, our PLG and AC members, and you can access all of the resources, webinars, and recordings. So I'd like to finally just thank so much the Women's Shelter Canada for inviting Transform to present. Thank you to everyone out there for listening, and a very special thank you to our PLG and AC members for their ongoing engagement and guidance throughout this project. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy. What an interesting and information-filled presentation. Before we pass it over to Veronica, I just wanted to remind folks, first of all, that you can go ahead and put questions in the Q&A at any time, and we'll keep an eye on those for the end. I also wanted to just acknowledge someone had pointed out in the chat to me that when I had mentioned murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls earlier, it was a perfect opportunity to recognize that as well. Many of those who are murdered and missing are trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individuals. And so I just wanted to thank that person. I don't want to name them in case they don't want to be named, but thank you to the person for pointing that out. And I just wanted to make that acknowledgement as well. So thank you for that. And so I will pass this over to Veronica.
Thank you, Liam. So my name is Veronica Merryfield. Despite my accent, I currently live in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, on the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. I've been living there for about 5 years, and people have got to know me after I started becoming much more public about some of the work I do. I'm trans. I'm actually intersex too, but I didn't find that out until towards the end of my trans journey when surgery uncovered it. So I kind of identify as both, although some people don't quite understand that, but it is the way it is. I bring my own personal experience into training wherever I can, given that the number of suicides and violence to trans women is particularly high in a lot of places. So I got involved with the Willow House women's shelter through being asked to give staff training. And that staff, I train a lot of organisations based on my first-hand experience, which includes domestic violence and being made homeless when I transitioned. So it's important to me that the shelters are understand the issues that they are going to face in providing an inclusive service. So I work with the staff of Willow House, but I also work as I volunteer. I volunteer as a board member too. And because of my involvement in multiple communities, multiple organisations in Cape Breton, I get to meet with people that may need the services of the shelter. And I get to meet with people who have used the services of the shelter, which gives me a unique perspective in being able to help formulate policy and help train. A lot of things that Wendy spoke about are very important. Things like inclusive language. But one of the things I do find is that when organisations try to use inclusive language, they often start putting in more and more terms to be more inclusive, thinking that it's better if they have more terms. But what you're actually doing is becoming more exclusive because you are dividing those communities. So one of the efforts with both Willow House and other support organisations in Cape Breton is to change the linguistics away from using lots of terms, using what I sometimes refer to as the alphabet soup, the LGBTQ, AIQQ, etc., etc. It becomes too divisive in its own view, its own self to try and resolve inclusivity, as opposed to just being very careful around the structure of linguistics. So that's one of the things I've been doing. The policies at Willow House were somewhat old when I joined the board, and we are in the process of revising those policies to provide better linguistics around inclusivity. So I make myself available. I don't work in this field. This is purely a volunteer effort, but I bring to it my first-hand experience of both domestic violence, of homelessness, of accessing resources as a trans person, of working in or volunteering in other organizations, with being part of community. I founded a support organization for trans people in Cape Breton, to provide resources, to provide help. I really wasn't expecting to, or I don't expect to spend a lot of time talking here, just to let you know that I'm available to help, and that first-hand experience for staff training, for board members, is very valuable in making sure that those things can happen. I think one of the biggest things for a lot of people is the ability to have somebody that they can talk to, who has that first-hand experience, who is willing to be open about how that experience impinges on the organisation. I'm expecting that we'll have more questions around this, and really that's what I would be here for. So if you have your questions, line them up, and we'll spend a lot more time later with me answering questions. So with that, I'm going to keep it short.
All right, thanks, Veronica. And yeah, I do really encourage folks to put their questions in. I think it would be great if we could have a longer, like, interactive question period. And I see some folks putting them in already. So yeah, so we'll keep those up. I'll move over to Carly now, and then I am keeping track of those questions, so we will get to them at the end. So Carly, do you want to take it from here?
Perfect, thank you, Leah. And thank you to Wendy and Veronica for sharing all of their valuable information and insight thus far. It's been a really interesting webinar, so thank you both. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Perfect. So my name is Carly, and I work with the Wheatland Crisis Society here on Treaty 7 territory in Strathmore, Alberta, about 45 minutes east of Calgary. We do have a short time together today, so I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. And I do have 3 case examples that I'm hoping to get to at least one, if not 2, with you today, that can just provide some kind of practical, realistic examples of why this work is so important and vital. So the aim of what I plan to share with you all today, actually I should go to our next slide here, is just to share some details about how a domestic violence shelter can support all people, as well as just the reasons that we feel that it's so beneficial and so vital to be able to support all people. I'd like to preface the conversation by stating that us here at the Wheatland Crisis Society, we fully and completely acknowledge that we are not the experts in the field of inclusivity. We happen to operate on an inclusive practice model, but the reason why we're able to do that is through things like this and through knowledge sharing, and we're still learning every day. So I believe that we can all learn from each other, and that we're going to learn from our mistakes as well as our triumphs as we move along. So we are not the experts, but we do come with a wealth of experience. We've been doing this type of work for a very, very long time, since our shelter began, which was 1992. So however many years, 28, 29, I think now. The theme of this webinar is to learn from each other, and I hope that I can provide some insight about inclusive practices and what they can potentially look like. We do receive quite a few inquiries about our practices and our model in our shelter, and I'm really excited to be able to share this with so many people. You know, what we've learned walking our path with this today. So please take what resonates and leave the rest, and we are definitely open to questions at the end. So who are we? A few highlights about us. We began as a very small, very grassroots shelter in the community of Strathmore. Currently, I think about 15,000 people live here. Back then, it was far, far fewer. So very small, rural farming community. It was, started just with volunteers. There was no funding. It was donated space. It was literally just a group of concerned community members that just wanted to make change in their community. So we currently have 25 beds in our building, and our funded stay is 3 weeks. And so we are a nonprofit, but we do receive some core funding from the government of Alberta. That 3-week stay is of course flexible just based on people's needs. And we'll get into that a little bit in a couple slides, I guess. So in addition to shelter, we do also offer outreach programs to adults and children, court support, as well as a very comprehensive public education program. And something I'd like to highlight is that our emergency shelter space, our 25 beds, those are available to people coming from anywhere. And we feel that's very important in doing the inclusive work because people do come to us from very far away, sometimes because we are the only shelter that's able to support their needs. I'm using the term domestic violence, but we often use the term for our shelter anyways. I use the term family abuse shelter over domestic violence shelter and over women's shelter. The reason for that is that, are we a women's shelter? Absolutely. Are we a domestic violence shelter? 100%. But as Veronica had mentioned, I think the use of language is so important here. And so I think when we use the term women's shelter, that insinuates that we only help women, which we don't. And when we use the term violence, I often think that our brains are kind of pre-programmed. When we hear violence, we think physical, we think hitting and punching. And so we like to use that term abuse because we actually feel that in itself is more inclusive and more broad. Because for lots of folks that come in, they don't come in to a shelter or for lots of folks that come in, they'll identify physical abuse, but what we'll find out later is that they actually experienced years of emotional and psychological abuse, but because it was never physical, because it was never violent, they didn't feel as though they deserved or required help. And so we want to change that narrative. So language is certainly important. So the way that we like to view working with all people is peripheral. So if you know what peripheral vision is, it's like the side that you see over here. You see it, but it's kind of fuzzy, but it's always there. So if we don't have peripheral vision, we kind of just see this or like really tunnel visioned almost. And so this just gets blocked. And so we often use the term a peripheral lens. So we like to think that we add this peripheral lens that allows us to focus on those pieces that aren't always in the forefront of this field. But we like to focus on them just as much as what's right in front of us. So it's not that we don't look at family abuse or IPV or domestic violence through a gendered lens, because we do. If we didn't, it wouldn't allow us to acknowledge that this is a gender-based issue, with the large, majority of survivors being female identified. We view this issue through a gendered lens, but we've added this peripheral lens so that we can include additional viewpoints where we can support all people impacted by this issue. Working with all people, it does not come at the expense of women and their children. This is a question that we have had over the years. We consider the inclusion of men, of trans folks, of non-binary folks, of two-spirit folks, of gender diverse folks, and of multi-generational families, not as them or women, but them and women. It's an and situation, it's not an or situation, and the world is changing. We recognize all people are impacted by abuse, and we work really hard to support all people impacted by abuse. So what do we do? What does this look like in reality in our shelter? What are the elements of this? So I'd like to share with you just a few of the pieces of this. Some of the themes, the major themes within our work, is that help is available to all genders. No matter how someone identifies, no matter what their ID says, we work to support all people as they come to us and as they identify. I'd like to share with you as well, I think for a lot of folks, myself included, when I started working with WCS about 5 years ago, I was like, oh, you support men. I've never heard of that before in a domestic violence shelter. And what I came to learn over the years in speaking with the founders of the shelter I had mentioned it was very grassroots before. And when they started this shelter, they felt as though we needed a crisis shelter for people in the community because it was outside of Calgary. There's lots of people living rurally, and they needed a shelter for people who were in unsafe situations. And so when it came to the question of gender diverse people or people not identifying as a cis female back in '92, they just said, well, why wouldn't we? That seems silly. Like, we're creating a crisis shelter. Anyone can create crisis, or anyone can be in crisis. So yeah, that's just what we're doing. And so I think now, sometimes it is viewed as this like forward thinking thing, especially for a small rural shelter. But, the founders of the shelter just didn't even give it a second thought. Why? Well, of course we would. That's always been the mentality. And so we've been doing this work since the very beginning because it was the right thing to do. And that was just exactly how it started, just simply because it was the right thing to do. And so over the years, this model has evolved and we've added many more things into the mix. But the reason why we do this is because we feel as though it's the right thing to do. So the dynamics of our house, I do some crisis work inside the shelter as well, or I have. And so oftentimes we get asked about the dynamics of our house when we have a variety of genders within the program. And one thing I would share with you is that I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it teaches, what I've observed anyways, is that it teaches children that certain genders aren't unsafe. It teaches children, to interact with everyone, as well as our clients too. So we don't have specific programming based on gender. All of our programming is just for people within our program. That's just how it is. And so when we can have a mix of people sitting in a room sharing their shared experiences of domestic violence or IPV, that's what's important. And I think that there's some beautiful learning opportunities, specifically with our staff and with our clients, as it relates to people's experiences of abuse as well as our own bias. And so it's a beautiful thing when we have a diverse household. So that's how I would explain it. We have our rooms, so we have 7 bedrooms. Most of them share a bathroom, so it's 2 rooms and then 1 bathroom that is accessed in the hallway. So if we had a family in room 1 and a family in room 2, those 2 families would share the bathroom for those 2 rooms. Families in our shelter always have their own space. They're never required to share. They always get their own room. And for single individuals in our shelter, we really think it's just on a case-by-case basis if they're going to be sharing with another single individual. Of course, we want to be able to offer a safe place to as many as possible. So sometimes that includes sharing spaces. But we like to think of it as, we're not going to ask someone who's come to our shelter from a very traumatizing situation. Let's just say someone comes in and they've just experienced a horrifically violent attack or a sexual assault or something in that regard. When people come to us in that way and they say, I just don't think I can share a room right now, we want to honor and respect that. And we feel it's the same with gender identity. And so we really let our clients take the lead, let us know what they need, and we try to support them as best as we can. And so if somebody's telling us, I don't want to share a room, I can't share a room or a bathroom based on X, Y, or Z, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be related to gender, but it can be, we do our very best to support them in that. So that's kind of how we handle the issue of it, is we really just let our clients take the lead and let us know what they need. And we support them in what they need because they know themselves and their experience is best, and we want to provide a safe place. So we try to just use gender-free language. That's what we roll with. So we try to just use they, them in all of our literature, including our website, social media, brochures, paperwork. Our policies all include making sure that all genders are included, both within our who we work with as well as our staff, and that people are protected within our building. We do ask for people's gender identity on our assessment, and we do have check boxes for anything that anybody would tell us, and that's totally fine. We don't assume gender. And we just have a lot of partnerships with organizations that work to support gender diverse folks, cis men, multi-generational families, you name it. So, and lastly, we work hard to make our shelter inviting. So we have signage, we have decor and artwork that reflects an inclusive environment for all people. And that's of different cultures, that's of different genders, that's of different sexual orientations, you name it. We're always trying to hang something up to make people feel welcome and seen, and knowing that we are a safe place. And all of our staff, of course, we did Rainbow Ready training with Stage S, but that's something that we talk to our staff about right when they're first hired. This is how our shelter operates on this model. Does this align? Is this a fit for you? I believe it's the same in working for maybe like a faith-based organization. For a lot of folks, that may or may not fit for them personally, and it's the same with us. So we always like to let people know up front, this is who we are, these are our values, and we want to make sure anybody that we're onboarding fits and holds these same values. So I have just a wee bit of time. I will just share one case study quickly with you. And this one that I'd like to share, I think, is a great example. So Connor had come to us, and he's an example of a multi-generational family that an inclusive model supports. So he called requesting shelter space for himself, his mother, and his niece and his nephew, both under the age of 5. So Connor and his family identified as Indigenous, and we really observed this family to be extremely like a high-functioning closed circuit. They were co-parenting together, and it was something that was working really well for them. So they were fleeing family abuse from his sister, who was the biological parent to the 2 children that were with him and his mother. And his mother had a parenting order to where she had custody of these children. So they were unable to stay in the home due to the abuse. And so he also outlined to us that he experienced just some historical, like the systemic racism from medical professionals, many systems, a lot of distrust within systems. And there was a lot of barriers for him to accessing services based on his gender. So through supporting them, we had a strong focus on their emotional needs while they stayed with us, and we were able to successfully get them transitioned into supportive housing where they could all live together in the city of Calgary. So when he departed, we asked him, what was the most important thing you learned while staying here? And his response was that I can reach out for help and not be turned down. And so I think that was something that really resonated with us. We like to touch on the length of stay, and I'd mentioned this before. So Charlie, just to give you some context, was a trans man who came to stay with us, who had actually been trafficked up to Canada. And so they came to stay with us, were with us for 56 days before successfully transitioning into a private rental. And then James was a male with 2 teenage children with very special needs and disabilities as related to physical disabilities, as well as cognitive disabilities. And so for all of them, they stayed much past what our funded stay is. And I think this just goes to show the lack of resources for folks that are out there in terms of, what are those next steps after an emergency shelter? And so we can see that they're staying quite a lot longer. And then just to round it out, this is, I think, kind of my last slide. So we understand that families and networks look different for everyone. And, we have chosen family, we have extended family, we have family networks, you name it. And so we feel as though to be a culturally safe space, we need to honor families and offer to help and support them no matter what the makeup of that family is. So we do acknowledge that abuse affects all people. And we acknowledge that abuse affects women, Indigenous families, transgender people the most. And so through our inclusive practices, we don't aim to, again, work with all people at the expense of any group, but we just aim to do this work to support all people, just because it's the right thing to do. So I'd like to share just a few of the resources here in Alberta with you as well. So some partnerships that we've had is the Calgary Counseling Center. So they do offer a male domestic abuse outreach program, which they refer a lot to us. The Kantara Safe House in Brooks, that is a domestic violence shelter, and they can support all people. The Phoenix Safe House in Medicine Hat as well supports all people. As far as I know, Jesse's House in Morinville also supports all people. And then we have some wonderful partnerships with organizations in Calgary, such as Skipping Stone, Calgary Pride, as well as here in town, like our local GSA clubs at our high schools and things like that. So we're always trying to do work to create partnerships to let people know we're here for them. And that's all I have. So thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our story and some of our information with you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carly. That was a really wonderful presentation and some great examples in there. So we do have lots of questions, which I'm super excited about. There's some really great questions I've been seeing as they come in. There's a couple that are more specific to some of the things that were mentioned in people's presentations. So I'm going to do those first, and then we'll get to some of the broader questions after that. So don't worry, your question will be answered. So I'm going to start, Veronica, with you. I know you answered this in the chat, but just for anyone who isn't sort of keeping up with the chat, there's a lot going on there, but there were a few people wondering about, examples of inclusive language that's not exclusive by kind of adding all those terms. So right. Yeah, you had given a great example. I just wanted to give you a chance to speak a bit more to that.
I'll just take that as, yeah. So it's one of the things I often find is that wording will introduce terms. So if it might say woman, including trans, non-binary, two-spirited, etc., etc., etc. One of the nice ways to get over that is to say that you're using the term woman in its most inclusive, and then you don't need to include anything else. One of the dangers when you do try to expand it and introduce other definitions is that you are already showing that there's an exclusivity in there, and you're likely to miss something too. So it's better just not to use it at all. And that goes for using other terms too. The caveat to that is when you're trying to look at certain things, say you're looking at violent statistics against trans women, you would use that term. As far as the LGBT thing and the alphabet soup, usually when I'm teaching this, I will start off by using the term LGBT, etc., etc. And then after that, I will say alphabet soup, and then I will go on from there. I've not had to use that in wording yet, or in written words, but I would probably come up with something very similar to get away from trying to make sure I'd remembered every letter, when the whole point is to try and avoid using them all together.
Awesome, thank you. And what I can do, because I know there's some resources being shared in the chat, as well as that example you gave, Veronica. So I will pull those from the chat at the end, and I can include those when I send the email with the recording link, so that everyone has the training that Carly mentioned, and the resources Wendy has been sharing, and that example from Veronica. So don't worry if you're scrambling to try to get those noted down. I will share those after. So there's one or two specific questions for Carly, I believe, for Wheatland. So someone is asking, does Wheatland, does Wheatland Shelter hire male and gender diverse staff?
Yes.
Awesome, short and sweet. And so then sort of a similar question, I guess, or sort of wondering what the breakdown of your clientele is. Yeah.
For sure. So I don't have it off the top of my head, but we do typically publish those details in our report to the community every year. Our report to the community from last year is a little skewed because COVID really hampered what we were able to do. I would say the majority of folks that do come to us are women and their children. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the majority are women. Last year we saw quite a number of men. But yeah, I can get you the actual data on it, no problem, but I don't have that off the top of my head.
Sure, yeah, that would be great. And I'm happy to include anything in a follow-up email as well. So we have a question here that maybe I'll put to Veronica first, and then Wendy, if you want to jump in with anything, if it came up in the research or if there's anything you want to speak to, you can jump in as well. So the question is, women's shelters have, I guess, sort of conventionally not been recognized as a safe place for trans, two-spirited, and non-binary people to access. So how do we get the information out to those communities that we support them, and if they need a safe space to call us? So Veronica, I'll go to you first for that.
Make sure I unmute. I think letting people know that, or letting a community know that it is a safe space, is about making sure that you connect with the community. Certainly that's something that's happening in Cape Breton, but a lot of that I think is through my community involvement. I certainly think for other shelters, reach out to community organisations in the trans, two-spirited, non-binary world. Often there's going to be something, and if you can't find it, I'm happy to try and connect you. I've got a lot of contacts across Canada.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Veronica. Wendy, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you did want to jump in, if there were any other thoughts that came out of the research, feel free.
Yes, I'll just quickly add to Veronica's note. I think the importance of representation is important, and engaging those who are a part of the trans, two-spirit, non-binary community to be a part of these, developing some of the outreach strategies, engagement strategies. I think that's key and core to really building trust and showing that organizations are genuinely engaging with these communities in ways that provide support, capacity building, and opportunities for them to also be a part of the organization and engage in building these very inclusive outreach strategies.
Awesome, thank you. Carly, is there anything you want to add?
I couldn't have said it better. I think between what Wendy and Veronica have said, so not for that one. Thank you though.
All right. So another question we have here, and it's a little long, but I'm going to read it out because I think it is a really great question. So I'm reading the person's, not me, but so I have asked questions where I work about what the concern is regarding mask presenting identities in the transition house. I was told that mask presenting identities can be triggering, so masculine sounding voices, presence, strength, etc. I was curious if this is actually a valid concern. Is this an outdated perspective? Women who have experienced abuse will encounter masculine presenting people in the community, in grocery stores, doctors, etc. So it's not avoidable in any case. So I think just sort of putting that out there for any reflections or thoughts any of you would have. I'm not sure who would like to take this first, but feel free to, Carly, go for it. And then I'll open it up to Veronica and Wendy.
Certainly. So I just like to validate whoever asked that's a really common question that we get asked. And so one thing to note is I know through our shelter anyways, in our experience, is we have the way that we work our assessment process in helping all people is that means that we can't accept people right at our door. So if someone shows up right at our door, that's just for the safety of the building, we're unable to just let them in. So what we ask is for folks that need to access the shelter is that they call us and just complete a very brief kind of basic assessment, just a little bit about what's happening, and just making sure we can support their physical and their health needs essentially, and that we have the space to support them. And so as part of that assessment, it's our responsibility to let people know before they even try to access our space, what our space is. And so we say, we support all people, and that means all people. And so, how does that feel for you? What is that going to be like for you? And I would say the resounding responses that I've gotten on our crisis line anyways, is that, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, everybody experiences abuse, right? So that has been kind of the common theme. I would say in all my time answering crisis calls, I've experienced maybe one or two calls ever where it has been an issue for people. One was based on religious belief, and another was based on just really really intense traumatic experience that happened like immediately preceding the call, where a masculine energy would have been like a huge trauma response would have resulted. So what we did is we supported that individual to access a shelter space that maybe met their needs more, and it worked out successfully. But in all of the calls ever, I would say that the vast majority say, yeah, I guess, of course, why wouldn't you?
Awesome, thanks, Carly. Veronica, did you want to jump in?
I will do. And my point I think I want to add here is that everybody experiences something that's going to trigger them. Whilst we're talking mostly about domestic abuse perpetrated against women from men, that's not the only case. Certainly for women's shelters, having experienced abuse from a female domestic partner is not uncommon and is equally likely to be triggering. I think the thing is for people to understand that everybody has different triggers and to work with that.
Great, that's a really important point. Thanks, Veronica. And I know you had put a question in the chat, actually, sort of a reverse question period here. So if anyone, if you're keeping an eye on the chat, you wanted to sort of contribute to that question that Veronica has asked about, how many shelters have diverse representation, either on staff, board, or in some other capacity, feel free. The chat's a great avenue for that. So thanks for keeping that active. So we do still have some questions here. I'm going to keep moving through them. One of them, I think probably Carly, you're best placed to answer this, around how do you deal with supporting families when you're full? When the shelter is full, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a broad question. That's a problem that affects all shelters. So oftentimes what we will do if we do not have capacity, and especially for our clients who do not fit, I guess, the model of like a traditional women's shelter, we work really, really, really hard to find them safe place. Sometimes what that looks like is using emergency funding for a hotel until we can offer them space. Sometimes that looks like reaching out to some of those shelters I had identified in our presentation to see if we can work to find space. Emergency social services for hotel space. We work really, really, really hard. And so if we are at capacity and someone is at high risk, and especially if they're from our local area, we're going to try and figure out a way to keep them safe, whatever that looks like.
Great. And yeah, I'm going to kind of keep going through, but if ever Wendy or Veronica or whoever I haven't put the question to, if you want to jump in, please do. I just want to make sure we do get to the different questions here. So we have a question asking about danger assessments and whether that's different, or how you kind of go through that, either for the different kind of models of family that you've spoken about. And this person has noted also same-sex domestic violence. So who would like to take that one first? Do you want to start, Carly, and then I'll open it up to anyone else?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a great question. So we do use the danger assessment in our shelter, and for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's a risk assessment tool to measure the level of risk as it relates to lethality. And it's a great tool, but it has its limits, as we all know. And so it is designed for women who are having abuse perpetrated by men. The long and short of it, I know there's some other versions that they've been working on, to my knowledge. We do not use the DA with folks who the DA is not designed to be used for. We don't feel that it's fair. The DA can be triggering in itself. And so we don't want to use that with someone when there's really no there's no value in it because it's not designed for that use. So I know that there's some research going into creating DAs for gender diverse people and relationships or like different types of relationships and things. But as far as I know, it's strictly for women who are experiencing violence perpetrated by male intimate partners. And so I think there's lots of great research happening, but we don't use them with anyone who they're not designed to be used for.
Thanks, Carly. Veronica or Wendy, would you like to add anything on that one? Okay. So this one I'll put out to all of you. Yeah, so this person has said that their shelter is in the early stages of learning and implementing inclusive language. There's a lot of work to be done for the shelter to be fully inclusive. Is there any shelter in Quebec or Montreal that you know of that caters specifically to the 2S LGBTQIA+ community? I guess they're thinking about, other resources or organizations in their area. So I don't know if any of you have come across any that you want to sort of share with that person, or any other thoughts on that if you're just getting started and maybe looking to other folks in your community who've done more of this.
I haven't, but I can probably dig around to help see if there is something around from my side of the community, if whoever it was wants to get in touch.
That's awesome. And I think, Veronica, you had put your email in the chat perhaps, so that person could reach out.
And yeah, when you do the thing at the end of this to give to everybody, I'm certainly happy for you to share my email address.
Okay, that's wonderful. So I will, I'll include that for anyone who did have a super specific question there. Mm-hmm. Did anyone else want to, Carly or Wendy, jump in there before I go to the next question? Okay, and so this next question is the last one in our Q&A right now. So if anyone has been sitting on a question, feel free to put it in while we're going through this last one, because we do still have a little bit of time here if there are other questions. So this person is sharing that they are in northern Saskatchewan, small population, large geographic area. There's a lack of services for gender and sexual diversity support in general, beyond like a few localized groups. And so they're sort of working on those gaps. They've approached some community members who've said that they would like them to start some GSD support groups. And so they're wondering if anyone has advice for a women's shelter that is taking the lead in providing those supports at a community level. Beyond what has been shared, they have mentioned that they're going to be looking into some of the resources shared, but I guess anything beyond what's been said already.
I mean, I'm trying to think, because it was, it's, again, I had mentioned it's something that we've always kind of just, done, but I guess forming as many partnerships as you can. As I know, our municipal government here, like our town office and our mayor and our council and our FCSS office, has been wonderful to us in terms of getting the words out and helping us create more partnerships within the community. We're actively, well, pre-COVID, I should say, we were very actively involved as well in our public educator and our Gay Straight Alliance at our local high school, worked kind of hand in hand on a lot of different projects. And I think anytime you can collaborate with an organization that fits on projects, the better. I think it's because when you have two organizations that maybe have like different demographics or different mandates, but they're kind of, there's some overlap. And if you can come together with people on, creating a community group or an art installation or whatever it may be within your community to get that ball rolling. The beauty of it is that now all of the people who are involved in their stuff get to say, oh yeah, you're involved with these guys. I didn't even know they exist, and vice versa. So I've found taking that kind of role to be helpful. I don't know if that is helpful or not, but.
Yeah, so there's just a clarification here that the person has just added. So they don't have any existing groups to collaborate with or anyone to collaborate with. And so they're being asked to start a community group. And so just, I think, wondering about some advice or guidelines and going about that maybe in a good and effective way. So I don't know, Veronica, if you had any thoughts you wanted to jump in with?
when I have been in a couple of communities that didn't have support groups for specific communities, I just started them, advertise it somewhere, and Facebook's good for that, and get it going. Make contacts with as many public places as you can and publicize it. See what happens.
Awesome. And there are some suggestions coming in the chat as well. So again, a reminder for folks to keep an eye on that as well, both for Saskatchewan and for the person who had asked about Quebec. So that's great. And thanks everyone for putting in so many things into the chat. There was a follow-up question here about the danger assessment piece, Carly. So the person is wondering, so does that mean that you are not using the danger assessment revised, which is available for those in a same-sex relationship?
We are working on it. There's just been some barriers to that we just in terms of training and things, but yeah, we're aware, and that's definitely coming down the pipe for us. But yes.
Great. So yes, so there have been two more questions that have come in, which is wonderful. So one of them is wondering if anyone has suggestions on any good counseling services that are more geared towards gender diverse people.
I think that probably depends where you are. There often is counselling services available for the Rainbow Mafia, as somebody typed in the chat. Actually, trying to find them can be quite hard. If you're looking for one-on-one in person, I guess you're going to have to do some looking around and asking within the community if you can find the community. When I've needed counselling services myself, I've done it remotely with specialists, and there's a number of online services that do that and do it really quite effectively, but they're not Canada based, they're worldwide, and they try to find a counsellor that matches exactly what you need. And my experiences, both for myself and others, suggest that they do it really well. So I'll put that out there.
Great, thank you. Carly or Wendy, did you want to add anything? Okay, so the last question we have queued up here, someone mentioning, so they've had recent challenges in terms of staffing and having to hire really frequently. There's a lot of turnover in the sector. They're having to keep up with training of new staff, casual staff, people who are really new to the field. And I know this is something that happens across the country in shelters. So they say that they use a lot of online resources, but they do that on the staff, I guess, do that on their own. And so they find it difficult to be able to kind of answer questions, debrief, provide feedback as folks are working through those resources. So they're wondering if there are any suggestions or advice on how to kind of effectively do this process in your organization. So, that kind of onboarding, training, that kind of thing when there's a lot of turnover. So maybe Veronica, if you have any thoughts first, and then I can go to Carly and Wendy.
I do, because what we've ended up doing is re-rolling me doing training sessions on a regular basis. There's always questions that come up, even for the staff that have been around for a while, and new staff obviously have questions. So that's kind of how I've been doing it. And that's across multiple organisations too. I effectively do the same thing. Shelters aren't the only organisations that see a rapid turnover of staff. Other organisations providing similar-ish services have the same problem. So it really is about keep doing it.
Great, thanks. Carly, did you want to add any thoughts?
Yeah, one program that we found hugely beneficial, and we've had such positive feedback from our team, and I've taken the training myself a few times, is through Skipping Stones in Calgary. So they have a wonderful speaker who will zoom into your organization and provide kind of like an hour or 2 hour, whatever you're looking for, just in terms of like language and knowledge and just everything. And their program is so wonderful. So we try to offer that. Usually once a year, give or take. We also offer our staff the opportunity, if there's ever webinars such as this or anything else out there, we try to send things out to our staff often. And what we do is we offer the opportunity. We say, if you'd like to do this and it's not on work time, we will pay you for the hour to do this. But it's up to you. It's totally optional. And so we're constantly trying to send things just as this, especially in this age of COVID. I think that the information sharing that's one positive thing is we, across the country, we get to all learn from each other. So we try to support our staff in that way. And then, yeah, with our new stuff like diversity training in general, just about a variety of different topics as it relates to diversity, has become part of our mandatory trainings. We're still trying to work out the kinks of exactly which one to use, but I'd wholly recommend Skipping Stone. Reach out to them. They are incredible.
Wonderful. Wendy, did you want to add anything? I know there were some resources that you shared earlier.
Yes, and just to quickly add to the amazing responses shared by Veronica and Carly, I think having the opportunity to create space with your team and build capacity. So once we've had these conversations or we've gone through the resource or the webinar, how do we allocate time to really debrief and talk about how does this relate to the work that we do? Creating safe spaces for staff to talk about without judgment, what are some of the gaps? What are some of the challenges? How can we create a transparent and safe space for staff to talk about the areas that they are experiencing challenges, areas that they may not be fully aware in, and areas they're not confident in? And how do we create that safe space for us to explore that as a team in a capacity building way and not in a non-judgmental way? So I think creating those spaces to build on that knowledge and apply it, as Carly was saying, the maybe consultant who comes in and hones in on your organization, and they're able to be very specific to how does this relate to you serving this demographic and your clients. I think that's really important. So whatever ways that we can create those spaces to support our team and build on the knowledge, that's really important as well. And creating opportunities for learning and growth. Right? That we're all learning together, we're all figuring this out, and resources and information is one aspect of it. How can we continue to create spaces where our organization can support the larger staff capacity in kind of driving this forward, and always bringing in folks who are a part of these communities to come in and lead those conversations. So if you have a chance to hire Veronica for some training, make sure that you do, or bring in folks who are part of the community that can support and build on your staff capacity.
Awesome. Thank you, all of you. And so that was the last question we had. So what I'm going to do is just go to each of you and just ask any closing thoughts, last things you want to put out there that you haven't had a chance to say, or you want people to kind of walk away with. So just some really quick closing thoughts here. So I'm just going to follow my screen here, which will be Carly, Veronica, and then Wendy. So Carly, over to you for some last thoughts.
Thanks, Leah. I just would like to thank everyone. I learned a lot today. And as I had mentioned in our presentation, we certainly don't claim to be the experts, but we have been doing this work for a long time. And so if ever your organization wants to know just the day in, day out practical things of anything that wasn't covered here, we're always happy to zoom in, and when things turn a little bit more normal, to do tours and things. But please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. I'll put my contact details in the chat, and of course you can find us online. But we're always happy to support other shelters who are thinking about potentially making that move. We're super open and willing to information and knowledge share. And just thank you all for coming to this awesome conversation today.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. So Veronica?
Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for listening to me. And following up from Wendy's selling me, yeah, I'm available. for advice, chats, help, Zoom in, knowledge from personal experience, please get into touch. Don't hold back.
Thanks, Veronica. Wendy?
Love it. Yes. So I want to thank everyone today. I want to invite, if folks have any other questions or thoughts, our program director, Laura Hartley, is available to answer any questions. I've shared her email in the chat, programdirector@medtrack.org, and she is so happy to follow up with anyone who may have any further questions. We also invite you to please visit the project website by visiting Medtrack's website, which I've also added in the chat, medtrack.org/transformed. And there you'll find so much more information about the project, the PLG, the advisory committee members, and how you can access all of these amazing resources, webinars, and recordings. And again, I just want to thank the Women's Shelter Canada, Leah, our amazing interpreters, for inviting Transform to present. We want to thank all of you who came out today for listening, for participating, engaging with such amazing questions. And a big thank you to Carly and Veronica for sharing your brilliance today in this conversation. And we hope that this really just is the beginning and sparks more interest and motivation for us to continue to build more gender inclusive spaces. So thank you all so much, and thank you for having us.
All right, well, I couldn't really have said it better myself, so I won't say too much more, but thank you to all three of you for these wonderful presentations, and to everyone who's participated. I love how many resources have been shared in the chat, and so I will collect all of those into one place and share the contact info when I share the recording, which will probably be next week. So yeah, so stay tuned for that. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to the interpreters as well, who've been doing a wonderful job this entire time. And just one final note, when you close the webinar, you will be taken to a feedback survey, and we really encourage you to just take a minute, fill it out. We are always looking for ways to improve, for ideas on other topics you want to hear about. So please do take a minute to fill that out when you log off this webinar. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we will, I'm sure, see many of you again at a future webinar. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye.